Hi guys, I'm back, and this time I'm going to talk about biomes, which are covered in chapter 16 in our essential geosystems textbook. So we are going to open up the PowerPoint and start to think about what a biome is. Okay, let me get started here. Okay, so first of all, we're going to kind of try to just walk through what is a biome so that we can understand the concept. And then in the next presentation, we're going to kind of go through what the actual biomes of the Earth are. So first of all, a biome is essentially a kind of ecosystem. So first of all, I want to define the term ecosystem. An ecosystem is a group of organisms, so meaning living things, and their physical environment. So the physical environment is things that are not alive, like water and air, that occupy the same space, so live in the same habitat together, and function together in an interdependent manner. So the organisms affect the non-living parts of the environment, and the non-living parts of the environment affect the organisms. Okay, so I think most of us are pretty aware that we are affected by our physical environment, right? We know that we need water, we know that we need air to breathe, we're affected by the temperature outside, but sometimes we overlook the fact that living organisms also affect their physical environment. So trees affect humidity in the atmosphere, or shading, or temperature on the ground, or of course humans can affect the composition of the atmosphere. And so there's important kind of feedback between living and non-living parts of ecosystems. So one example of this is that in 1492, many people know Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He came from Europe and he came into the Caribbean. And after he landed, he, quote unquote, discovered this new world, and many other Europeans followed. And the ensuing interactions between these Europeans and the native peoples that had lived in the Caribbean contributed to tens of millions of people dying. We're not sure exactly how many people were there to start out with, but we know that a combination of direct warfare, but then also the transfer of different kinds of diseases to populations that had previously not been exposed to them caused high fatalities. And so in a short period of time, there was tens of millions of people that died off in this new world area. And as a result, there was a big ingrowth of areas that had been previously cleared by the people that had lived in this part of the world to support their different agricultural systems. So they had pretty complex agricultural systems, growing maize and other things like that. And as there weren't as many people anymore to work in these systems and just as many people to feed, there was a big ingrowth of native forest land into these previously more open areas. And these trees, as they started to grow, pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as they photosynthesized, and they contributed to what was a mini ice age. So this graph on the left-hand side is showing that there was this drop-off, this cool period in the early 1500s that's known as the Little Ice Age. And most people attribute this to this big ingrowth of reforestation after this massive die-off of people in this huge genocide that happened in the New World after the original kind of contact with Europeans. So obviously this shows that there's all this complex interaction between people, social systems, and then living organisms and their environment. And all these things are very interconnected, which is the point that I'm trying to make. Okay, so our goal is to not try to disentangle all these complex interactions, although that's very interesting. That's what the field of ecology is all about. We just kind of want to understand what a biome is, and we want to understand why we would have different kinds of biomes in different places on the Earth. So a biome is a large-scale ecosystem. So we can have ecosystems that are very small. We can have ecosystems on the scale of like a Feather River College campus ecosystem. We can have ecosystems inside of our stomach lining. But a biome is a very large-scale ecosystem. It's usually kind of defined by the plant community that we find there. Okay, plants don't move around like animals, so it's easy to kind of see where certain kinds of plants start and stop, and then kind of define that as a boundary between different biomes. Biomes are also terrestrial, meaning that they exist on land. So we have many important ocean ecosystems, open ocean ecosystems, kelp forests, coral reefs, intertidal zones. Those are not terrestrial ecosystems or biomes. And then also, we already talked about the idea of these different Köppen climate zones, these areas on the Earth that have defined climates based on their temperature and precipitation. So these biomes are going to very closely match the boundaries between different climate zones. And I think most people wouldn't be totally surprised to hear that because, of course, climate has a big impact on living organisms. If it's dry, certain organisms are adapted to live in those ecosystems. If it's wet, if it's hot, if it's cold, etc. Okay, so climate, as we just said, influences organisms. Most of us are not surprised to hear that. And this happens particularly in two ways. So first of all, there's a concept that we call tolerance. So each organism over its evolutionary history has been adapted to tolerate a certain range of kind of physical environmental factors. So some organisms are adapted to live in hot temperatures or dry areas or cold areas or wet areas or windy areas. So they have these different capabilities that they've evolved over time to live in a certain place that has certain characteristics, okay? And if that those characteristics change, if it's all of a sudden hotter or colder, they may not have the kind of just inherent physical capability to survive there. So they have a tolerance for a certain type of climate. And then also photosynthesis, which hopefully most of you know, is this process that plants perform. And photosynthesis is the basis of the food chain. It's basically the way that plants capture energy from the sun and turn it into a form of food, which is essentially energy that plants can use. And this process is the basis of the food chain. So plants can photosynthesize, other organisms can't. Well, some photosynthetic bacteria can, but animals can't, fungi can't. So we need to get our energy from plants, or we need to get our energy from things that have gotten their energy from plants. So it provides the basis of the food chain. And can you remember what's required for photosynthesis? Hopefully some of you remember that is water, carbon dioxide, and energy from the sun. And plants use those three things in combination to create sugar, which is the energy source that drives all ecosystems and living organisms, and oxygen, which is then needed to burn the sugar, to combust the sugar, to release the energy when it's needed. So water is obviously a big climatic factor. The energy from the sun is a big climatic factor. And then the light from the sun is actually what's required for photosynthesis, not necessarily the heat energy from the sun, but also the heat energy of the environment, which is related to how much energy is coming in from the sun, also impacts the rate of photosynthesis. So when it's warmer, photosynthesis can happen faster. So obviously, there's a strong connection between what's going on in the climate and how fast photosynthesis is happening. And how fast photosynthesis is happening has big impacts for what kinds of ecosystems or biomes are going to exist in different areas. Okay, so I just want to think about a couple different kinds of adaptations that an organism might have to survive in a specific type of climate. So first of all, let's think about water, and in this case, lack of water. So in a really dry environment, we will have only organisms surviving there that have evolutionary adaptations to deal with very limited water access, which, as we've just said, is important for photosynthesis. And so organisms that live in these environments need to have an ability to store water so they can access it when it's available, and then they can store it for months or in some cases years as necessary. So these saguaro cactuses have a structure kind of like an accordion. and they can swell up, like opening up a fan or accordion, and absorb all kinds of water when it does rain in a limited rainy season. And then they can use up that water that's in their basically water tank on the inside of the cactus throughout the year. Other plants that live in dry areas may have waxy coating, kind of like if you think of a manzanita type leaf. And this waxy coating helps prevent water from evaporating out of the plant and desiccating or drying out. And it also reflects light, so it helps keep the plant a little bit cooler to slow down evaporation. So those are kinds of adaptations that dry land plants would need to have. On the other hand, some plants can actually struggle when there's too much water. So some plants might not be able to tolerate really wet conditions, and wet conditions, a challenge for organisms in a biome, might be that the soil is not very strong, right? Wet soil turns muddy. When you step in wet soil, you might sink, or your car might sink down into it, and that's because it's not very strong. And when it's wet, it also might have a hard time supporting plants. So many plants that live, especially big plants, big trees that live in very wet organisms, like in the rainforest, have to have big kind of buttress systems where the roots actually above ground provide a structural foundation that helps keep the plants up. So this kapuk tree is showing that structure because the plants in our area depend on the soil to help keep them up, and plants in a wet area would not be able to do that. Okay, another thing is temperature. Ranges of temperature might be a challenge for organisms. So in areas that are very hot, organisms need to have ways to cool their bodies down. In this case, we have two different animals, a kangaroo and a vulture, and they're both trying to cool their body down by taking advantage of evaporation, which we talked about earlier. So hopefully many of you remember that evaporation is a process that requires or quote unquote steals energy from its environment and leaves its environment cooler than it was before. So we said humans sweat and then the water evaporates off our body. It steals the energy from our body and cools our bodies down. Okay, many other animals don't have sweat glands, but they try to work on ways of getting their body wet so that their body will evaporate even if they live in dry places. So kangaroos lick their inner arms aggressively during hot periods, and they have veins that go straight, or arteries that go straight from their heart right out to their arms, carrying all this heat from their inner body. And then they try to keep their arms wet so they'll quickly evaporate and help cool the kangaroos down. And you can see this thermal image of the kangaroo below, showing that its arms then are a lot colder, and then its ears also that are a little bit moist are colder than its internal body, so that helps cool it down. And then vultures are famous or infamous for peeing on their feet. Every time they need to pee, they pee right on their feet. And again, their feet have some arteries that are carrying blood that's hot from the internal part of their body, and then the pee evaporates off their feet and cools them down. So don't try this at home, but this would be a potential way to get your body to cool down. Of course, on the other hand, there's a lot of challenges to organisms that can be associated with cold temperatures. So, for instance, many animals that live in cold areas have big fat reserves, lots of blubber around them if they're like a marine mammal, or lots of fat around them to keep them warm in cold temperatures. Or many organisms hibernate, burrow underground, and create a little place where they essentially sleep during a cold part of the year to help kind of prevent their bodies from losing energy during this time when there's not very much energy around in the environment. Plants have different kinds of structures. Many plants pump sugars or kind of almost alcohol type compounds into their cells during a time of year. And the presence of these different kinds of compounds prevents the freezing of the water inside their cells. So just like something like vodka doesn't freeze in your freezer, if the plant can fill up its cell with these kinds of compounds that have a much colder freezing temperature than water, then they can keep their cells going throughout the winter. That's what like conifer trees do. Other kinds of plants, of course, just like lose their leaves or go dormant during parts of the year when it's going to be too cold. So that would be a temperature adaptation. And then the climate doesn't just affect the direct environment right around the plant, but it can have other kind of indirect impacts on ecosystems. So one impact is that when it's really wet, often soils lack nitrogen, which is an important nutrient that most plants need to be able to build cells. They can pull that up from the soil in most conditions. But this nitrogen is turned into a form that plants can access by bacteria, and bacteria that live in the soil need oxygen. And when the soil is too wet, like in a marshy environment, the water kind of blocks the oxygen from getting down into the soil, and so soil bacteria are not able to transform nitrogen into a form that's accessible for organisms. And so plants that live in these marshy, boggy environments have had to develop adaptations to access nitrogen in other ways. And so many organisms have developed an ability to capture insects and then have relationships with different kinds of bacteria that break down the insects inside the plant and then release a plant available form of nitrogen. So these are called carnivorous plants. Venus flytrap on the left is one of the more famous kinds of carnivorous plants. And then cobra lilies are local to our area, and they're pretty neat kinds of plants that you might have seen in places like Butterfly Valley Botanical Area. So these adaptations are required by the plant because of the climate's impact on their physical environment. And then a couple more things I want to mention are that one, an organism doesn't only need to be adapted to live in the kind of average climatic conditions, but they also need to be able to survive extreme climate events that exist within a certain climate zone where they might be living. So, for instance, if they live in a region where there are intermittent hurricanes, maybe they're only once a decade or once every 50 years, but if an organism wants to continue to exist in that ecosystem after that event occurs, it needs to have a way to either as an individual survive, or it needs to be able to regenerate new individuals of the same species, like from seeds or something, that are in the soil after that climatic event has occurred. So again, that might be a hurricane or that might be a fire system. Many ecosystems have to be adapted to survive fires. So here's a couple examples. The top picture shows a picture of cones that are called serotinous cones. They experience serotiny. So these kind of pine trees that grow in lots of parts of California have completely sealed cones, and the seeds for the pine trees are not released and never end up in the soil until a fire happens. The extreme heat from the fire breaks down the sealing on the cone and releases the seeds, and then new plants of that same type can grow after the fires happened when all the other competition is out of the way, right? All the other big trees in the shade have been wiped out, and then new babies of that same species can grow quickly in that environment. In the bottom, there's a picture of what's called a longleaf pine, which is another adapted pine. This is something that grows in the southeast of our country. And on the left, you see a picture that almost looks like a grass, but that's actually the baby pine tree. It grows in that form for periods of time and develops a root system, and it might look like this for years, and it waits until a fire happens. When the fire burns over the top of the tree, it kills off the needles, but the root system is still in place. And then that acts as a catalyst that causes the plant then to grow very, very, very quickly using its big root system that it's already built over many years before the fire up into a vertical height. So these trees can shoot up like 6 or 10 feet in the period of a year or two. And then hopefully at that point, they're big enough and tall enough to survive the next fire. So that would be a climate adaptation. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge that in order for an organism to live in an area, it doesn't only need to itself be able to survive in the climate and the physical environment there, but it also needs to have other organisms that it works together with, that it has symbiotic relationships with, That's called symbiosis, when organisms work together. Okay, and so we all have many organisms that we also depend on to be able to live, and that organism needs to be able to survive in the climate where you are as well as you. So in this picture, we have a plant that is two pictures of a plant that's called Amorphophallus, which means kind of a funny looking phallic object, which is a funny name for a flower, appropriate name for these very large flowers. And these flowers are so stinky that this lady on the right is wearing a mask just to be in the area next to this plant. And these plants use the stinky smell to attract flies that act as pollinators for these plants to be able to live and regenerate. So this is an example of the plant doesn't only itself need to be able to survive in a climate, but it also needs the flies that it works together with to be able to survive in this climate as well. Okay, so hopefully that helps you understand the importance of climate in organism survival. And then we're going to take a break, and the next lecture is going to be about the specific terrestrial biomes that exist on our planet.